So we have been in this series called ETHOS, Sacred Values for a Struggling World, and we've been exploring week after week what are some values that really can point us towards not only the kind of people that we want to be, but perhaps the kind of world that we are hoping to create together. And something that I hope is clear as we've been on this journey, we've been having different conversations, we're bringing in guests to share their reflections. And what I hope is clear is that this is something that we're all in a process together on. We're all striving for it together. There really are no experts, right? We are all human beings working this out in real time together. And so when it comes to today's value, when we're talking about vulnerability, I want to be the first to admit that I am still learning and I am still, in many ways, struggling to live from, as Brene Brown says, one's whole heart, right? To live with that wholehearted courage. We know that we only can access, a percentage of our brains, right? Compared to what's actually all there. We remember that movie Limitless, right? Where he could take a pill and he could experience his whole brain for a little bit. And I was thinking about this in terms of the heart, recognizing and even pondering, right? What percentage of my heart am I using? And really wanting to experience far more, right? Wanting to open it up and to realize that perhaps vulnerability is the key to that. And really to experience that in community, that we can show up with our whole hearts together, right? But we need to recognize the importance of this thing called vulnerability if we're going to be willing to take the risk that it brings. And so I want to start with a beautiful quote from a wonderful poet named David Whyte, who he really in this quote, I think, gives us a picture of what vulnerability is and what it isn't. He says, vulnerability is not a weakness, a passing indisposition, or something we can arrange to do without. Vulnerability is the underlying, ever-present, and abiding undercurrent of our natural state. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. The attempt to be invulnerable is the vain attempt to become something we are not, and most especially to close off our understanding from the grief of others. And when we look at vulnerability from this perspective, it doesn't feel like it's optional, right? Not if we want to actually truly heal, truly live from our whole hearts, if we want to move into the world that we want to see, right? It feels like it's a necessity, like it's vital, because without this type of vulnerability, it's as though a part of us dies, right? And we become cut off and disconnected from truly understanding and experiencing the pain and really just the reality of life that others face. And from this perspective, we can look at this and say, yeah, well, and this is really the source of so many of the problems we face today, so many of the things that we are currently struggling through as a society, that in many ways they find their root in a lack of vulnerability, a lack of empathy, a being disconnected from our own hearts, from the hearts of others. So let's go back, right? Let's start from the beginning. Let's build from the foundation and really explore what is vulnerability, right? How do we find it in our own lives? And the first thing I'd say is that in many ways, vulnerability at its core is how we relate to these parts of ourselves that we often don't know what to do with. And we might call it like our brokenness, our imperfections, our flaws, the cracks, the things that we often want to hide and cover over, right? And how do we relate? How do we, are, like Brene Brown says, are we able to bring those to the fore, or are they things that we push into the background? And so I want to just start with, a couple of ways that we've probably thought about brokenness in the past, right? One of which I think can be helpful and one of which I think can be harmful, right? So I'll start with one that I find that, I've thought about brokenness in this way in the past, and it's been harmful. It hasn't really helped me. It's something that I've tried to move beyond. And it's this story that you might have heard before. And it's basically this story that, at the beginning of the creation of the world, there was a man and a woman who ate a piece of fruit. And because of this, right, every one of us are born broken. We're born wrong. We come into this world inherently out of alignment with our source, with our creator. This is a doctrine or a philosophy known as original sin. And I think the problem here is that it treats our flaws, our imperfections as a glitch, as something to be corrected, as something to be fixed as part of the great cosmic plan, something that, we can perhaps even in this life try to fully erase and wash away. And I find that disintegration that we experience with our own true selves to be really harmful. And so it's a frame that I personally reject. I don't find it to be helpful. But there's another frame that we might bring our brokenness into. This is the second story, the second perspective. And it goes a little something like this. We as humans, right, are on this long, slow, often painful, but also beautiful journey, evolving into greater love, greater awareness, right? Greater capacity for empathy. And we know it can be a very difficult journey, right? We're facing some of that difficulty right now as a people, but it's nonetheless this journey that we've been on evolving into greater love. And yet we still all show up into this unfinished work in progress, right? And so we are born into a world with pain, right? And we are born to parents who were given sort of an incomplete instruction manual, right? And we're handed an incomplete instruction manual, and we do our best, and we try to figure out, right, how we're supposed to live, who we're supposed to be. But it's always a work in progress, and therefore it's a world with trauma and a world with pain and a world with flaw. But yet from this frame, I find that our brokenness is also our beauty, right? That they are two sides of the same coin. That we all have stuff, right? We all have the pain that we carry from the past. We all have the ways that we wish we were different, or ways that we wish things would have gone. And we carry those things. But rather than avoiding or ignoring or trying to fix those parts of ourselves, I think the invitation here from this perspective is to embrace them, to see it as part of this beautiful journey of evolving into greater love. But how many of us know that our world isn't necessarily built for that? Our world doesn't currently do a very good job of holding that, of holding our imperfections, of creating spaces where we can be vulnerable, or we can exist imperfect in our pain. In many ways, our vulnerabilities are not really accepted in the world that we live in. In many ways, the interactions that we experience day to day aren't really built for or structured for the type of vulnerability that we actually need to be able to have with one another, right? You go to the grocery store and someone asks you how you are, and you're not actually able to say how you're really doing, right? In a way that would be healing and cathartic for you. Imagine if you could, though, right? You're at the grocery store, you're checking out, right? And the cashier's like, that age-old question, did you find everything okay? And you're thinking, well, Trent, it's good you asked, because, my parents had me when they were pretty young, and so they were doing their best, but, they're flawed. They're working with the trauma from their parents, and so, I'm just doing my best too, and I also grew up in a religion that, gave me a very narrow idea of what life was supposed to be like. So I've worked through a lot of that, and it was painful to let go of, but I'm also just living in this world. Have you looked out, this world, right? And you're trying to figure out what's my place in the world, but everything seems to be falling apart, so it's hard to know who I even am. And so, no, Trent, I'm not really finding everything okay. So often our interactions, our daily communication isn't built for this, and then we look for the places and spaces where we might find more of that safety, right? Like maybe at some point in your life, you did go to a church, a faith community, as a place that maybe was going to be able to hold your vulnerability, a place where your brokenness could be embraced. But if you're like me, you probably didn't get what you needed. Because again, so many of the churches that we find ourselves in still operate from this original sin mentality, seeing our vulnerabilities and our imperfections as things to be fixed rather than to be embraced as part of the human experience. So we walk through this world, right, not ever really getting the safety that we need so that we can trust and allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And so what do we do instead? We learn to mask. If you were here last week and we heard from Ryan Meeks, he talked about this idea that we mask with one another. We wear masks and we think that they're protecting us, right? But in many ways, they're keeping us from the love and the connection that we desire. But we know that this world that we live in, so much of the culture, right, is built around these masks. It's why the culture that we exist in many ways feels very skin deep. And the problem is that I think really on some level it's killing us, right? Because the very masks that we wear, they're the barrier to what we actually need to thrive as human beings. Richard Rohr says it like this: we wear the masks that keep us from the very love we long for. Perhaps the work of a lifetime when it comes to vulnerability is the work of unmasking. Perhaps this is the verb of vulnerability, to unmask. This is vulnerability in action. And yes, perhaps there is always going to be another layer, right? So may we devote our lives to this work. It's kind of like those magicians who are pulling the scarf from their mouth, and they're just they keep going and going. You're like, how is there, I think I'm remembering now that they're probably not actually pulling it out of their mouth. It's like an illusion, but okay, you know what I'm saying. These masks, right? They're there and we think they're protecting us, but in many ways, they're inhibiting us, right, from experiencing love, light, the very oxygen that our souls need. And so in many ways, these masks are actually suffocating us. And it's unmasking that lets in the light, that lets in the air, that lets in the love that we so desire. How many of you remember that beautiful Leonard Cohen line? There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, right? And so from that logic, when we cover our cracks, when we hide our cracks, there's no light getting in. And there's certainly no light getting out, right? So we're not really able to be experiencing the healing that we want, nor are we able to be the healing that we want to be for others, right? And so this, friends, is why I think of vulnerability as a sacred value, because if we can unmask and be, right, not fixing, not unmasking and immediately trying to fix or to cover over, gloss over, right, cure, solve, but instead when we can unmask and just trust that we are held in our truth and who we are, just that act alone, right, it begins to heal ourselves and heal others. Because you've heard it said, right, the truth will set you free. And it's your truth that will set you free, right? So I want to try some of that for myself today, and I hope that, later as we close that you'll have an opportunity to do the same. I want to try to unmask, right, as a way of just modeling what I think it can look like. Not that there's certainly not one right or wrong way, but I want to just give it a shot myself and just try to take off some layers here. And I want to be clear, I'm not using this as my personal therapy session, right? I have therapists, so don't you worry. But the idea is if we peel back our layers, then we also get to see ourselves wherever someone else is being vulnerable. And it perhaps, hopefully, is an opportunity and an invitation for us, right? Because, it's easy for me to stand on stage and say, hey, we ought to be vulnerable, and then in the very same sentence, I just kind of keep up with the status quo, right? It's easy for me to say, oh yeah, vulnerability is great, and then I get up here and say a couple things that aren't actually all that vulnerable, just enough that it's still very safe. There's no risk, right? I get up on stage and I'm like, oh, airplanes are stressful, and you're like, wow, he's so relatable, but there's no risk there, really, right? See, here's the paradox. Here's what I love about vulnerability. It requires risk. Vulnerability requires risk, and we don't like risk, right? Risk is not the natural thing that we all necessarily run towards all the time, unless you're Evel Knievel, right? But even he probably wasn't very vulnerable. Anyway, whatever. Vulnerability requires risk, and that's the part that we tend to fear. But the paradox is that the safer we feel in the hands and the hearts of others, the more risk we are going to be able to bring to the equation, right? And it leads to another paradox. The more that we risk, the more that we build trust, right? And then the safety grows, and then we can go back to risking again. It's a cycle. So there's this interesting relationship between willingness to risk, to bring risk to vulnerability, and yet the trust that gets built. So I want to try some of that risk today. And I'll keep it really simple, but it's just a truth that I've never shared on stage before. And it's basically just to say that I, on a weekly basis, deal with insecurity in my role. Stepping on stage, every week I have thoughts and I have experiences of what we might call imposter syndrome. Has anyone felt imposter syndrome before? If you have not, imposter syndrome is basically this feeling that you do not belong. Right? That you are not worthy of something, that you are a fraud, that you are not enough. And as I was reflecting on this, I realized that's my core question. That's my core issue right here, is that I've always felt like I was not enough. That's the fear. Am I enough? And so if you felt this before, you may have also done this next thing, which is you try to be perfect, or you try to fail as little as possible, so you keep up the illusion that you are not facing these insecurities, or you're not facing these anxieties. But that's the reality. That's the vulnerable truth, right? And now I know that Aldea is so much more than me and whether or not I feel insecure or not, but for me, that doesn't matter. That doesn't stop the core fear, because that core fear goes back to before I can even recall, right? These core fears are developed very, very young. And so they bring themselves into whatever we're doing in our current lives. So now, right, my anxieties, my insecurities are always saying, you're not good enough, right? You're not a good enough pastor, or you're just not a good enough human being. And so whatever you're seeing when you look at me, just know there are layers of insecurity and fear and anxiety, not just about my place here, but about my place in the world. Now, I want you to take a second, right? And as I've shared, just take a moment and reflect for a second, maybe what you're experiencing inside of yourself. Perhaps there's some of you, right? Bless your soul. But there's some of you who are thinking, oh, I'm going to go up there and tell him how wrong he is. He's so great, and I'm going to fix this for him, right? I'm going to get up there and make him feel great. And perhaps the reason you feel that way is because you want to fix it. And I know it's coming from a good place, but you might also be uncomfortable with just holding the reality of what I'm sharing, right? That sometimes we do this, right? Someone shares something and we just want to fix it. We want them to feel better. And in doing so, we sometimes skip over actually just holding it for them. So try what it might feel like just to sit in the reality of what I shared, and to be able just to, in that space, say, yeah, I understand, right? I hold that for you. I understand it. No need to solve, no need to fix. That's just what it's like to be Jake in this moment, and I just see you, and I hold you in that. And maybe that kind of trust is what we actually really need and want from each other, not to be fixed or solved, but to be held. As Henri Nouwen, the Christian mystic, once said, when we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain. How many of us have found this to be true in our lives, right? Those are the relationships that hold the most meaning, are those that just sit with you. They sit at your bedside. They hold you in your most difficult moments. That, I think, is true connection. Not the right advice, not the exact perfect solution, but that which can hold and share in your pain. It's powerful for me just to be able to trust you with that share, and I feel safer in this space, more secure, not because anyone, fixed it for me, but because you held it. And that's what I hope for this place. That's what I hope for this community, that we would be a space that isn't just the cure-all, the solve-all for anything that we're going through. It's where we go to be seen, to be heard, to be held in our hurt. May we create these spaces here in our lives, because I think this is what we need versus what we have probably often all experienced in some form or another, right? Whether in the spiritual community or elsewhere, where it was just about that solution that was going to make everything better, and yet it didn't. And so this frame, this way of approaching life and approaching vulnerability, it's risky. It is risky. Because I think of every act of vulnerability, every act of unmasking as a trust fall. And we've all seen the videos, right, where the trust fall doesn't go as planned. Someone's not paying attention. And that's because in life there are no guarantees, right? If we're talking about the risk of vulnerability, there are no guarantees. I can't promise you that every time you attempt a trust fall of vulnerability, it's always going to go well. But that's the point of risk, right? The more we risk, the deeper levels of love and connection we are making ourselves available for. Are you willing to speak true words about what it means to be you? That your truth might set you free from the burden of the mask. Because we know that there's this interesting relationship between love and vulnerability and risk. As James Finley, former monk who studied under Thomas Merton, says, it's a very vulnerable thing to be loved because you risk being seen. Sometimes being seen is the most courageous, the most wholehearted thing we can do. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to say, I'm hurting, right? I'm scared. I don't know. Sometimes that is far more courageous than jumping out of an airplane, right? Or running with the bulls, right? I know there's some of you who have ran with the bulls in here, and I'm no offense to you, but I think it can be even more courageous sometimes to share our deep vulnerabilities. So let's take a moment. Let's just talk a little bit about what's going on out there in the world, right? Like the thing that we're all dealing with. We'll call it the situation. In that, we are all facing massive change and upheaval on a scale that maybe some of you have never experienced. Some of us have never experienced before. And with all this change and transition and how overwhelming and overloading it all is, in some ways our masks and our armor has felt comfortable. It's come in handy, right? Because we don't know how to handle all that we're experiencing. And so these masks of outrage, these masks of disgust, right? Not that there aren't things to be outraged about, certainly, but we wear that on the forefront, right? And yet behind all that, there are layers of grief, there are layers of fear, there are layers of disappointment, there are layers of overwhelm. And can we be vulnerable about that? See, my job, many days, it feels like It's to provide an angle on all that we're facing, right? That feels inspiring, that feels redemptive, that has hope. And believe me, I am honored, deeply honored, to be able to hold any amount of space in your lives in which we're looking to try to find the hope and we're trying to find the light, right? It's a beautiful gift. But I also would like to share that many days I just feel sad, right? Or I feel scared. And I also would love to be known in that too. So the question is, can you just hold that for me? Can we hold that for each other? Maybe then we'd be doing something that communities like ours rarely are able to do, and yet it's the thing we especially need now more than ever, is to be able to provide vulnerability in all directions. That whether this is your first time here, or you've been coming here a long time, or you work here, whatever it is, that vulnerability is extended all ways. So that what if, as we face this massive transition, this upheaval, that we choose to let our hearts lead us through rather than our brains, right? That's so often the temptation, to use rationality and logic and our thinking minds to find a way through the situations that feel so difficult. Though it's risky and scary, what if we let our hearts lead us through? Here's the homework of this, okay? This week, you're going to be in maybe a conversation or 2 or 10 about what's going on in the world, right? And while the temptation is so often to share your angle, your thoughts on what's going on, what if, even just once, you had a conversation in which you led with your feelings, your fears, your vulnerabilities? What would that be like? Let's get practical for a second, right? Because there are places that we can go, there are spaces that can be cultivated where we can experience and practice vulnerability. The first I'll say is in nature. And that's a hard one right now because we are in the middle of summer, so it's like we don't get as many opportunities to be out in nature as we'd like, but nature has no masks, right? Nature is vulnerable inherently, right? It just is what it is. And so when we spend time in nature, we learn to drop our masks. And really, in a broader sense, we can think this way about stillness. When we spend time in stillness, we recognize that often our activity, our busyness, our movement from thing to thing, that too is a part of the mask. That too is a distraction from feeling the depth of what we actually feel. And really, that just leads us to the reality that our spiritual practices, whether they are built around stillness, or whether they are built around nature, or whether they are built around something else entirely, they are these invitations to connect within. Because there's a person that we need to be vulnerable with for sure, and it's ourselves to start. That sometimes the person that we deceive or fake out the most is ourselves, right? And so these options, spirituality, stillness, nature, these are tools that allow us to connect deeply within. I'll close with this wonderful statement from James Baldwin. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. What if the very thing that you're afraid to live without, that armor, that mask, is actually keeping you from the very thing that you need? That the removal of that mask and the exposure of that vulnerability is your salvation, is your healing, is your key to wholeness. May we embrace our brokenness and our cracks as the very space where the light gets in. That we unmask, not to be fixed, but to be seen and known and loved. May we lead not with our heads, but with our hearts, so that even in our pain and our grief and our fear, we know we're not carrying it on our own. If you're comfortable, I want to invite you just to close your eyes for a moment. As we've been talking about vulnerability. Perhaps there is a part of you that is asking to be noticed. Perhaps you felt something, right? Even that word, vulnerability, it causes you to feel something inside, something that is longing to be known. Perhaps the sensation is uncomfortable. Perhaps it's screaming at you. But I encourage you in this moment, in the stillness and in community, I encourage you just to notice that part without judgment. To notice it without hatching a plan to figure out what you are going to do, but instead allow that part of yourself, for it is indeed you, to allow it to speak. Maybe it speaks with words, maybe it speaks without words. But will you embrace it? Will you hold your own vulnerability? Right? Will you have the courage to embrace and feel all that is within you?